There are mountains in West Virginia where the snow does not fall as it does anywhere else in the world. It does not descend with the natural gravity that draws all things toward the Earth's core. Rather, it hovers, hesitates, and settles into the most fundamentally wrong and hidden hollows of the valley. And on those abyssal winter nights in Pocahontas County, the wind threading through the canopy ceases to be a sound of nature. The barometric pressure shifts, the currents of air are strangled through fractured ravines of stone, carrying with them the auditory imprint of whatever they have just passed through on their downward plunge. It sounds like the moaning of rotting timber, the grinding of ancient roots, and sometimes the protracted sigh of things that have long been buried. Our surroundings dictate how we confront terror. The light, the noise, or the utter stillness encompassing you at this very moment will forge how you receive or reject tonight's tale. Therefore, before I guide you up the ashen slopes of Strangler Ridge and tear open the loft door of the Purnell brothers in February of 1956, leave a comment below to let me know from what corner of the world you are listening. Are you ensnared in the clamorous traffic of a metropolitan heart, where the amber streetlights never extinguish and the blare of horns serves as a ceaseless reminder of humanity's existence? Are you alone behind the wheel, driving down a desolate highway in the dead of night, your headlights tearing through the gossamer fog of the plains? Or are you curled beneath the covers in a diminutive room, where a solitary nightlight casts grotesque elongated shadows against a mute wall, no matter your location or your time zone? In this precise moment, take a glance out your window. Is it as pitch black and coagulated as the window panes of that secluded cabin? If it is, I earnestly advise you to reach out and double-check your locks, not because someone is prowling upon your porch. The most primal fears of mankind often deceive us in that regard. For tonight's narrative will dissect and expose a ruthless truth regarding the human mind. Sometimes, the meticulous locking of your doors is not meant to prevent something from the outside from forcing its way in, but rather to trap the thing inside along with you. Isolation is not an empty room. Isolation is a hollow stomach, and it possesses an insatiable starvation to be filled. In modern psychology, a phenomenon occurs when human beings are thrust into sensory deprivation chambers, rooms completely soundproofed and black as pitch. They term it the reverberation of cognition. The human brain, evolved over millions of years to ceaselessly scan its environment for the snap of a twig, the footfall of a predator, or the call of its own kind, will never submit to absolute silence. When the noise of the physical realm is extinguished, the mind will desperately manufacture its own acoustics. It amplifies the rushing of blood coursing through veins against the eardrum, the thrumming of a heartbeat like a war drum, and eventually, it conjures voices. It sculpts hallucinations to anchor you to reality, to keep the psyche from slipping into the abyss of nothingness. It is a survival mechanism. It is a singular delusion, a frantic individual endeavor to reject total solitude. But what transpires when the isolation does not merely last a few hours, but stretches agonizingly across decades? And the more terrifying inquiry: what happens if two men are simultaneously incarcerated within that stillness, and their minds no longer fabricate distinct, solitary illusions, but rather begin to witness the exact same entity? The Purnell brothers were not lunatics according to the screaming, destructive archetypes haphazardly shoved into cheap cinematic tropes. They were men eroded by seclusion, much in the way a centuries-long seep of water can hollow out a slab of solid granite. The elder brother, Octavius Purnell, was 47 during that fateful winter. He was a towering, lanky figure, bearing the gaunt disposition of those accustomed to chewing bland sustenance and toiling relentlessly until their vitality is wholly depleted. His right shoulder drooped slightly from a fall off a roof rafter more than 2 decades prior, granting his gait a perpetual sloping tilt, akin to a tree growing at a crooked angle to catch the sunlight. The hands of Octavius were chronicles carved in scar tissue. His knuckles were calloused, his fingernails thickened by nights of bitter frost, and a stark, horseshoe-shaped white scar branded the webbing between the thumb and forefinger of his left hand, the remnant of a feral horse that had bitten him in his youth. Yet the trait that compelled folks to avert their gaze when facing Octavius was his eyes. They were of a pale hue, so diluted they were almost entirely devoid of color. The mountain dwellers around the Marlington area would often whisper amongst themselves that Octavius's eyes did not catch the light. Please make no mistake. They were employing no poetic rhetoric or polished metaphors here. Highlanders possess no inclination to romanticize the abnormal. When they declared his eyes did not catch the light, they meant explicitly that the illumination from a storm lantern or the sun itself, upon striking his corneas, failed to reflect even a single glimmering ray. The light was simply swallowed whole into those two dusky voids, opaque and flat as the surface of a stagnant, dead morass. Lucius Purnell, 41 years of age, stood in stark physical contrast to his brother. He was half a head shorter than Octavius, but laid claim to a profoundly thick, barrel-like chest, broad as the gnarled trunk of an oak. Lucius sported a dense, unkempt black beard that had never known a proper trimming, obscuring nearly half of his countenance. He habitually stood in a peculiar posture, feet planted slightly apart, shoulders rigid and hunched, back tilted faintly backward. That was not the stance of a man at rest, but rather the bracing posture of one straining against an invisible, overwhelming force that was perpetually trying to topple him. Lucius was the very incarnation of a hostile silence. Many residents of the valley town swore they had never heard him utter a single syllable throughout his entire life. The scant few remaining claimed to have heard him speak but once in a fit of profound fury, and that hoarse, grating timbre was a sound they prayed would never grate upon their ears a second time. They had resided together upon the crest of Strangler Ridge since the passing of their father in 1938. The meager cabin, the pungent herd of half-feral hogs squealing on the southern slope, and a mountain that seemingly always imprisoned the wind within its deep ravines. No radio broadcasts, no correspondence, no neighbors. Repetition was the solitary anchor keeping them from drifting entirely from the shores of humanity. The rhythm of the brothers' existence was programmed with the exactitude of a rusted mechanical clock. One could set a calendar by their movements. Precisely twice a year, they would descend into the town of Marlington. Once in the spring, as the snow was just beginning to liquefy into mire, to trade the pelts of the beasts they had trapped. The second time, invariably in the autumn, to stockpile flour, salt, lamp oil, and, most crucially, pipe tobacco for Octavius. For years on end, Burl Hatcher, the proprietor of the Marlington General Store, prided himself on this immaculate predictability. In his twilight years, he would incessantly mutter the same recounting. Those brothers, they always crossed the threshold of my shop on the second Saturday of October. Same day, same hour. The exact same shadow cast across the sill, and they always ordered the precise same list of goods at the counter. Not a penny more, not a dime less. That is the method by which isolated men govern their reality. They erect invisible barricades of routine to prevent the chaos of the stillness from swallowing them whole. But then October of 1955 encroached, bearing a bone-chilling wind from the north much earlier than usual, and the rusted anchor of the Purnell brothers finally snapped. They did not materialize on the second Saturday. A week bled by in bizarre silence. When the wooden door bearing the brass bell of Hatcher's store timidly swung open on the afternoon of the third Saturday, Burl Hatcher immediately felt a certain frigid fog spill into the establishment. The aberration did not solely reside in the timing. It began to rot from the most minuscule of details. Octavius approached the counter. His pallid, lightless eyes swept across the shelves, as though it were the very first time he was laying eyes upon tins of beans and sacks of flour. When he dictated the shopping list in an impossibly thin voice, it took Hatcher a few seconds to realize what was glaringly absent. There was no tobacco. Octavius Purnell, a man who had smoked away dozens of beechwood pipes over 20 years, a creature who treated tobacco as his sole source of warmth on blizzard-swept nights, did not purchase tobacco. Hatcher hesitantly reminded him. In response, Octavius merely turned his neck with agonizing slowness, staring intently at Hatcher. That gaze harbored no hostility, nor did it carry irritation. It was vastly more grotesque than that. Octavius regarded Hatcher with the lifeless curiosity of a being trying with all its might to recall exactly what species the flesh-and-blood creature standing behind the register belonged to. It was a look of absolute, vacuous nothingness, piercing straight through Hatcher, piercing through the wooden planks of the back wall, and drilling directly into an undefined void. but that was merely the inaugural sign. The second, and the very thing that sent a glacial chill snaking down Hatcher's spine for years to come, was the absence of the dog. The brothers kept a square-jawed, black-snouted mutt named Brody, a taciturn, bristly mountain hunting beast that had dogged their heels for 9 grueling years. Brody invariably accompanied them down the mountain, forever lying obediently prostrate at the store's threshold. For Hatcher's wife would under no circumstances permit an animal to track mud across her floorboards. On that third Saturday of October that year, the stretch of wooden floor before the entryway lay entirely barren. There was no huffing exhalation of a canine breath, no rustling sound of a scratched ear. Hatcher, attempting to thaw the suffocating atmosphere coagulating among the three of them, forced out a stiff inquiry regarding the beast. Lucius did not deign to lift his head. He remained rooted there, his shoulders rigidly braced, his gaze glued so fiercely to the wooden floor it was, as though he were counting the splinters, his jaw clenched, resolutely sealing off all sound. Only Octavius spoke. He did not look at Hatcher. His voice was a low, thrumming rumble, thin and fractured, uttering 3 words that rattled like a pebble, rolling inside an empty tin can. He went off. That was all. He went off. That night, within the cozy confines of his kitchen, Hatcher recounted the incident to his wife, endeavoring to banish the clammy, macabre sensation clinging to his flesh. His wife, kneading dough with a dismissive shrug, grumbled that mountain hounds occasionally succumb to their feral blood, answering the call of a wolf pack or catching the scent of a vixen. Dogs wandering off was a mundane occurrence in unforgiving wilderness. Hatcher nodded, muttering his assent to such perfectly logical reasoning. He washed his hands and retired to his bed. Yet that night he could not find a moment's slumber. He lay staring fixedly at the ceiling, listening to the wind whistling through the window panes, and it was then he realized precisely why Octavius's phrase had filled him with such profound dread. A mongrel that had survived 9 years on the mountain, intimately familiar with every scent, every fox den, accustomed to the bone-shearing cold of Strangler Ridge, would never spontaneously go off in the waning days of autumn, right on the precipice of a brutal winter. Basic survival instinct would not permit it to abandon the hearth fire and the surplus hog bones. A loyal cur does not flee from monotony. It only runs for its life when confronted by something it instinctively knows its jaws cannot rend and its barks cannot banish. It runs from something it dares not even look upon. Brody did not go off. He had evacuated, and when you comprehend that even a feral beast must panic and surrender its territory, you begin to wonder, what exactly was slowly slithering up the peak of Strangler Ridge, gorging itself on the silence within the Purnell brothers' cabin, compelling them to forget their habits, to forget their tobacco, and to entirely forget their own humanity. The thing that was lethargically creeping up that summit, truth did not originate from anywhere. It may have always resided there, patiently coiled within the fissures of the boulders, waiting. Strangler Ridge was no insensate tract of earth. If you dwell long enough among the primordial forests of the Appalachians, you learn to identify pockets of space that possess their own respiration, their own heartbeat, and worst of all, a vindictive memory. The very geometry of Strangler Ridge was a deformity of creation. Nestled amongst gently rolling foothills, it thrust violently upward into the heavens like a fractured fang. To reach the Purnell brothers' cabin, one had to ascend on foot for 3 grueling hours through damp swaths of second-growth oak choked with the stench of leaf rot and mildew. You had to navigate a grove of chestnut trees that had been choked to death by the blight back in the 1920s. They remained standing rigidly upright, bleached white and utterly barren, impaled in long rows amidst the gray snow like the colossal ribcage of a leviathan, slowly fossilizing under the weight of time. At the saddle pass funneling into the clearing, the wind perpetually blew in the wrong direction, defying all laws of atmospheric pressure, violently frigid ice crystals directly into the corneas of any foolhardy enough to pass through. This stretch of soil seemingly suffered from an obsessive-compulsive fixation on mortality. It harvested and archived events of absence. Even the decaying cabin of the Purnell family was erected upon the foundation of something that had previously collapsed. It was constructed around 1880 by an aged timber surveyor named Gideon Croak, who, according to the delirious rumors of drunkards in the valley taverns, stepped out of his door alone one blinding, blizzard-swept night, marched straight into the profound wilderness, and never returned, failing to leave behind so much as a shredded rag or a splinter of bone. But Strangler Ridge had harbored a malevolent reputation long before the era of Old Croak. The indigenous Shawnee tribes possessed a distinct name for this peak, a labyrinthine string of guttural syllables choking in the throat that white settlers could not possibly pronounce, and bound to it was a legend that those very white men would rather feign blindness and deafness than dare to repeat. The father of the Purnell brothers, when he purchased this tract of land for a pittance from a derelict estate fund in 1910, was a taciturn, arid man. He considered superstition to be nothing more than a form of malingering for the indolent. He educated his 2 sons in the arts of forging iron, flaying hides, and deliberately ignoring the bizarre rustlings of the night. But superstition, or the truth obfuscated by shadows, is a monumentally patient entity. It can wait for you to age. It can wait for you to die. It will simply pivot to gnawing upon your children. The inaugural omen, indicating a fissure in the architecture of reality atop Strangler Ridge, manifested in early November. The chilling air had begun to calcify the mud on the ground into jagged bladed ridges. Veester Combs, a hunter of seasoned expertise, was fervently tracking the blood trail of a wounded buck along the eastern incline. Combs was a veteran who had seen action in the Pacific Theater. He had inhaled the stench of charred human flesh, borne witness to bloated corpses bobbing in trenches of briny water, and survived atrocities capable of permanently eradicating a man's capacity to believe in phantoms. Combs' worldview was framed by munitions, gore, and pragmatic laws of physics. He was not a creature easily intimidated by the dark. Late that afternoon, Combs lost his quarry's trail in a sunken hollow inundated with fog, situated roughly a mile below the Purnell cabin. The atmosphere was so profoundly still that Combs could discern the crystalline grinding of frost particles chiffing against the surface of his wool coat. He halted, unhooked the canteen at his hip, intending to take a sip, and in that very instant he heard it. It arose exceedingly faint, ostensibly hovering from a vast distance, yet simultaneously presenting the illusion of vibrating violently inside the very cavity of Combs' ear. It was a murky, lethargically protracted resonance. A low, droning humming. Combs stood paralyzed, his fingers petrified upon the canteen's cap. He pricked his ear, demanding his veteran's brain categorize the noise. It was not the wind shrieking through stone crevices. It was not the groaning of a leaning tree trunk grinding against another, and it was, most unequivocally, not a human voice. It bore none of the timbre produced by vocal cords of flesh and cartilage. However, the revelation that sent a rivulet of glacial ice pouring down the length of Combs' spine was that the sound seemingly possessed geometry, a pattern. It was cyclical. It sounded as though some indivisible entity were laboring to hum a melody it had forgotten the tune of millennia ago, and now it was sluggishly groping for the ascents and descents by touch rather than by ear. It was learning to mimic something. It was experimenting. Absolute terror does not reside in a scream or a snarl, for those are sounds of animal instinct that a human being can conceptualize and combat. Genuine horror dwells in a non-human resonance that harbors a glaring, undeniable intent. Veester Combs, the man who did not blink before the rifle muzzles of enemy combatants, slowly turned his back. He did not bother stooping to search for the buck's blood trail. He took long, silent, and frantic strides directly down the mountain, abandoning thousands of dollars worth of trapping equipment in his wake. When he arrived home just before the sun had entirely sunk, his wife asked in astonishment why he had returned empty-handed. Combs, with a glazed stare fixed unyieldingly upon the hearth, spoke but a single sentence in an arid rasp. There wasn't anything up there worth getting. He locked his rifle away in a secure cabinet and never, unto the moment he closed his eyes in death, set foot upon the eastern slope of Strangler Ridge again. Yet that anomaly of space did not remain stagnant. It bled outward languidly like an oil slick upon viscous water, devouring the fragile things upon its periphery. The second manifestation struck in late November, and this time it did not merely assault the auditory senses. It warped the very laws of nature right before a witness's eyes. Horace Pendry, a fur trapper by trade, was inspecting his line strung along the desiccated creeks bordering the eastern fringe of Strangler Ridge. Hoarfrost had blanketed the withered brush in a stark white crust, and the air tasted pungently of rusted mud. Pendry discovered with growing vexation that his first 3 fox sets had been sprung, yet were entirely vacant. No blood, no tracks, merely the steel jaws gaping absurdly amidst the decaying leaves, as if a violent gust of wind had triggered them autonomously. But upon approaching the 4th trap, Pendry froze in his tracks. Frost had crystallized around the chain links. A fox was caught in the set. The 12-toothed steel clamp had gnashed relentlessly onto its right foreleg, cinched down to the bone, and the beast was still breathing. Its rib cage still heaved with short, frantic respirations, expelling wispy plumes of white vapor into the sub-zero air. However, there was something amiss, something fundamentally wrong with the tableau. Anyone who has ever hunted knows intimately the most rudimentary reflex of a snared animal. Biology and the survival instinct compel it to exhibit only one of 2 reactions. Either it will ravenously tear at its own entrapped limb in a desperate bid to escape, or it will recoil, snarl, bare its jagged fangs, and rivet its eyes brimming with hatred upon the approaching predator, which was Pendry. When driven into an inescapable corner, a prey animal's gaze invariably locks onto the most tangible physical threat. That is an unbreakable decree of nature. Yet Pendry's fox did no such thing. It lay utterly flattened on its side against the frozen earth, its russet coat matted with frost. It offered no struggle. It did not deign to look down at the bloodied leg being pulverized by the steel maw. Nor did it bother to pivot its head to observe Orus Pendry, even though the man loomed a mere 5 paces away, a wooden bludgeon gripped tight in his fist. The creature's maw was slack, exposing pallid teeth, its drool leaking out to congeal into glacial filaments at the corners of its mouth and its eyes. Those glassy, feral eyes were rolled fiercely upward, staring with unbroken linearity into the naked canopy overhead. Its gaze was absolute, entranced, immobile. Pendry traced the animal's line of sight up to the soaring crowns of the timber. He squinted through the skeletal boughs that reached out like withered, clawing fingers against the leaden sky. There was no fowl, there was no snapped branch, there was no cloud of grotesque formation. There was absolutely nothing up there to behold, yet the fox continued to watch. Its stare was not the glazed stupor of a beast expiring from exhaustion. It was the gaze of hyper-focused observation. It was monitoring something suspended in the ether above, something infinitely worse, more profoundly absurd, and more all-encompassing than a torturous demise at the hands of a human trapper. The camouflage of the natural world had been peeled back, yielding to an alternate reality manifesting right overhead, a thing that Pendry, cursed with the mundane eyes of a mortal man, was wholly incapable of perceiving. But he could palpably feel its existence, through the manner in which the surrounding atmosphere abruptly condensed, crushing against his twin lungs, forcing his exhalations into choked, wheezing gasps. Gooseflesh erupting violently down the length of his arms, Pendry dared not inch a step closer. Driven by the swift, panicked reflex of a man who desires nothing but instantaneous flight, he drew the revolver from his hip, cocked the hammer, and discharged a single round point-blank into the fox's skull. The deafening gunshot lacerated the sepulchral hush, yet even in the microsecond the bullet burrowed into its brainpan, the fox's eyelids did not flicker. It carried that imperceptible vision directly into the realm of the dead. Pendry frantically gathered his chain, abandoned the entirety of his remaining sets, and plunged like a madman toward the valley, leaving in his wake the carcass of the beast, its eyes still glaring fiercely up into the mute void. In the mountainous topography of West Virginia during the 1950s, phenomena of this nature were rarely subjected to bureaucratic documentation or long-distance telephone reports to the authorities. Rugged mountaineers did not trek 10 miles through snowdrifts to a sheriff's precinct merely to lodge a complaint about having a bad feeling out in the timber. They kept it locked inside. Or they carried that clammy premonition homeward, allowing it to slowly seep out across the supper table. They whispered it to their wives as the kerosene phantasmagoria of dancing black shadows upon the walls. They confessed it to a brother or an old acquaintance while nursing a cup of bitterly steeped coffee in some obscured corner. The narrative did not travel in a linear fashion. It proliferated laterally, slithering through the stratums of a reclusive populace, worming its way past the skepticism of men who refused to believe in anything beyond scripture and ballistics. By mid-December, as the inaugural flurries of the season began to drift lazily down into the valley like a pallid shroud, those fragmented murmurs coalesced. 3 or 4 men in the township of Marlington, individuals who seldom shared a table, had by one avenue or another stitched the splintered mosaic together. They possessed the tale of Cum's unseen hum. They held the macabre gaze of Pendry's trapped fox, and they harbored the dangling sentence of Octavius Purnell, coupled with the utterly illogical disappearance of the hound, Brodie, from Burl Hatcher. When the first colossal blizzard assaulted the region on the night of December 23, 1955, dumping a layer of snow 1.5 feet deep upon the highlands in a single evening, only to heap upon it yet another suffocating blanket on the 28th, the meteorological snare had officially sprung. A brutal mute cold snap dominated the entirety of January, plunging the mercury well below zero for 9 consecutive nights. It was the caliber of winter one survives solely by collapsing oneself into a diminutive speck, demanding nothing of the external world and praying devoutly that the external world forgets you in turn. There were no telephone lines tethering Strangler Ridge to civilization. The singular, winding trail leading up to the cabin had been completely devoured by monolithic ramparts of snow. The Purnell brothers had endured dozens of solitary winters up there, and under normal circumstances, no one would be idle or neurotic enough to consider hiking up to verify their mortality. Simply put, the act of trespassing onto Purnell property in the dead of winter to inquire after their well-being would be perceived as a grievous insult to the pride of such mountain men. Yet the flesh-flaying cold of the outdoors seemingly paled in comparison to the frostbite gnawing at the sanity of Burl Hatcher. Night after endless night lying beside his slumbering wife, the grocer tossed and turned, glaring intensely at the pitch-black ceiling. The shadows within the bedchamber began to curdle. Within the ghastly stillness of the winter, where every decibel was sponged away by the dense snowpack, Hatcher could not stop the phantom of Octavius's visage from Cana itself before his mind's eye, the face from that third Saturday. The manner in which those soulless, washed-out eyes had drifted across him, laboring to decipher whether he truly existed or not. Hatcher recalled the cryptic humming, he recalled the paralyzed fox. And when the men of Marlington Township began to spend their nights wide awake, agonizing over the very things they desperately yearned to forget, it ceased to be a matter of mere curiosity. It was the juncture at which they realized that, whatever entity had laid siege to the cabin atop Strangler Ridge, it had been granted ample time to gestate. The embryo of madness had been sown, its roots buried deep into the floorboards, and now it was merely waiting for the first men brave enough to step inside to harvest the fruits of its terror. That forbidden fruit of dread had ripened to the point of rot, and the initial few compelled to march up the mountain to reap it were, in a stroke of cruel irony, the very men burdened by an uncleansable complex of guilt. Burl Hatcher's torment did not detonate into bouts of shrieking. It preyed upon him through the rustling scuffles beneath his bed frame, through the clammy chill oozing from the timber walls of his mercantile. By the final week of January 1956, when the frigid temperatures had effectively frozen even the most rational of thoughts, Hatcher coiled a thick woolen scarf about his throat and trudged grimly across the ashen township to a modest dwelling perched on the western fringe of Marlington. It was the residence of Talcott Reeves, a 68-year-old elder who had been a comrade of the Purnell brothers' late patriarch dating back to the 1920s. Unlike the corpulent and sluggish Hatcher, Talcott bore the mien of a desiccated birch trunk, gaunt, stooped, yet the bundles of muscle clinging beneath his pleated skin were as wiry and unrelenting as barbed wire. Hatcher knocked, stepping into a parlor suffocating beneath the stench of pine smoke and the musk of old age. He offered no pleasantries, nor did he meander through explanations. In a shattered voice, thick with phlegm, Hatcher uttered but a single sentence. "I think someone needs to go up there." Talcott, seated by the hearth whittling a dry branch, did not so much as lift his chin. His blade hitched for a solitary beat, slicing into empty air. The old man replied with unnerving composure, "I've been thinking the exact same." They exchanged not another syllable. The communion between men of the mountains requires no vocabulary to bridge its gaps. Both implicitly understood that they were not orchestrating a rescue. They were choreographing an autopsy. On the 11th of February, 1856, the relentless blizzard finally capitulated, leaving behind a brain-numbing void of silence. 4 men congregated at the foothills of Strangler Ridge before the sun could even lacerate the horizon. Burl Hatcher, his labored, wheezing breaths exhaling plumes of opaque vapor. Talcott Reeves, sullenly bearing a coil of rope and ruffles slung casually over his shoulder. Accompanying them was Wilm Rye, a county deputy, a mere 26 years of age, fumbling in a uniform that reeked of damp wool and cheap coffee. He had been banished up the hill by the sheriff primarily as an act of bureaucratic courtesy toward missing persons protocols, not out of any premonition of a genuine emergency. And the final man, Audric Sewell, 44, a professional lumberjack conscripted for the expedition solely because he possessed the aptitude to decipher desolate trails better than any living soul. They burdened a modest sled with their provisions, harnessed ropes about their waists, fastened snowshoes to their boots, and commenced their trudge. The morning heavens bore a sickly, tarnished gray, as dense and oxidized as a sheet of decrepit tin discarded in a junkyard. The cold did not violently flay the skin. Rather, it insidiously permeated through each layer of felt, threading invisible, icy fingers beneath their innermost garments to maliciously caress the lengths of their ribs. It was a deeply hostile frost, carrying the metallic tang of rust every time they dragged a profound breath down to the very root of their lungs. They climbed unceasingly throughout the morning. The sole auditory phenomenon remaining in this world was the lifeless, repetitious crunch of their snowshoes grinding into the crust of hardened ice. None bothered to unseal their lips to converse, for every articulated syllable demanded a tribute of body heat they could ill afford to squander. But the higher they ascended, the more the atmosphere mutated. The ether felt as though it were being compacted, growing so viscous that the simple act of inflating their lungs required agonizing exertion. Audric, the lumberman forever claiming the vanguard to read the path, was the first to sense the anomaly. If you have devoted a lifetime to felling timber, you memorize the silent symphony of the wintertide. The woods in winter are never truly, profoundly deaf. There is perpetually the clicking contraction of pine bark yielding to plunging temperatures, the muffled thud of a shattered bough tumbling into the powdery drifts, or the scratching scurry of a squirrel's claws upon timber. The standard quietude of a snow-draped forest is a placid stillness, a silence with distinct, discernible edges, wherein you can perceive the heavy thudding of your own heart and the rushing tide of blood against your own eardrums. But the sound, or rather, the profound absence of sound, that currently suffocated Strangler Ridge was an entirely different beast. It was starkly flat. It was empty to the point of nausea. It did not resemble a vacant room devoid of occupants. It felt like a chamber wherein every living entity within was simultaneously holding its breath, cowering in the darkened corners, glaring with unblinking eyes to observe exactly what the intruders intended to do. Audric halted, his boots sinking knee-deep beneath the snowpack. The lumberjack cast his gaze about the perimeter. There was not a single animal track to be found, absolutely none. The snow lay immaculate, as flawlessly smooth as a burial shroud that had never been disturbed. By all natural laws, there ought to have been the hoofprints of deer foraging for roots beneath the timber, the zigzagging trails of hares, or at the very least, droplets of avian excrement upon the white expanse. But all had been eradicated. The absence of fauna here was not a casualty of the frost. Beasts do not freeze to death en masse without leaving behind their corpses. They had evacuated. This entire mountainside had been systematically abandoned, driven by the most primordial of survival instincts. Audric pivoted, locking eyes with Talcott. He pointed a finger down at the unblemished snow, then jabbed it toward the murky, silent void suspended between the blighted, dead chestnut trees. Talcott followed the trajectory of his hand. The 68-year-old elder offered exactly one nod, agonizingly slow, his jaw muscles clenching into a rigid, sinewy ridge, and utterly refrained from offering any commentary whatsoever. The panic of mankind occasionally takes root in their refusal to give a thing its name. They resumed their trudging, cresting the saddle of the ridge right around midday. True to the perpetual conduct of this cursed topography, the wind at this mountain pass surged upward from an entirely aberrant direction, defying the barometric pressure of the valley below. It did not sweep horizontally. It coiled from beneath, blasting into their faces like icy spectral hands attempting to tear the woolen caps from their skulls. The scent of the gale carried a rank, cloyingly sweet flavor that was profoundly alien, bearing no resemblance whatsoever to the aroma of pine resin or decomposing foliage. It was the stench of something that had been hermetically sealed deep beneath the earth for far too long. Approximately an hour after surpassing the shoulder-shaped crag, the forest clearing finally materialized before their eyes, and suspended within that desolate void, the Purnell cabin loomed into view. It remained standing, drowning in an ocean of ashen snow. Yet from the very first glance, some innate instinct churning within the guts of all four men twisted in simultaneous revulsion. Their eyes began to register aberrant details, jagged puzzle pieces that fundamentally defied the physical logic of the living. The rough-hewn brick chimney was entirely mute. Not even the thinnest wisp of smoke drifted upward. The atmosphere hovering above the roofline was freezing and stagnant, utterly devoid of the thermal turbulence produced by an active hearth. The snow had drifted violently against the porch, piling into a mound that swallowed more than half of the sickly gray wooden door. On the southern slope, the hog pen gaped hollow. The pungent, half-feral swine that incessantly squealed for slop had evaporated without a trace. But the detail that sent a violent shudder through Audric was not the emptiness itself. It was the gate of the pen. It stood wide open. It had not been torn asunder by the gale, nor had its hinges succumbed to rot. It had been pulled open from the outside and lashed securely to the fence post with a length of dark cord, braided from an exceedingly strange material that, from this distance, they could not identify. A calculated, deliberate act. Yet the most horrifying detail, the one that poured a ladle of jagged ice water directly onto the central nervous systems of the four men, sat right beside the porch. The woodpile, a wall of perfectly bisected firewood, stacked with a neatness, a squareness, and a tightness that bordered on the obsessive. It was the signature stacking method of Octavius Purnell, the morbid pathological perfectionism of men who have lived in solitude for far too long, extracting a bleak joy from the repetition of meaningless tasks just to keep their minds from fracturing. The snow capping the woodpile was a foot deep, devoid of any signs of having been rummaged through or depleted. They stood paralyzed at the tree line, roughly 30 paces from the cabin. The air felt utterly purged of oxygen, suffocating to the point of asphyxiation. Burl Hatcher's jaw slacked, swallowing hard against a thick wad of saliva. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, thudding with such ferocity he feared the men beside him could hear the cadence. The naked, merciless truth lay exposed before their very eyes. The Purnell brothers had not met with an accident. They had not exhausted their fuel. They were not forced to endure the flesh-flaying frost because a blizzard had barricaded their firewood. The untouched woodpile meant they had voluntarily ceased using the stove. They had made a conscious decree that the fire was no longer necessary. Or, infinitely worse, something inside that mute wooden house had persuaded them that darkness and sub-zero temperatures constituted the most perfect state of existence. What could possibly compel a creature possessing the ferocious survival instinct of a human being to willingly discard warmth in the dead of the most brutal winter of the decade? What had they discovered that could replace the heat of a flame? The young deputy, Wilm Rye, unable to tolerate the silence that was crushing his eardrums, cupped his gloved hands around his mouth and called out. He bellowed the names of both brothers. Octavius, Lucius. The sound torn from his throat was paper-thin, quavering, and pitiful. It soared into the murky expanse and was instantaneously devoured by the coagulated air. There was no echo, there was no reply. His voice was snuffed out as swiftly as a lit match tossed into a bog. He called out a second time. The supreme tension forced beads of sweat to erupt across his brow, despite the sub-freezing temperatures, a clammy, cold sweat reeking of pure terror. Still, no answer arose. Not a single shadow darted behind the window panes frosted opaque by the rime. Not a rustle emanated from the unlatched hog pen. Absolute silence. An aggressive, toxic stillness bled from the crevices of the wooden cabin, creeping all the way to the toes of their boots. Talcott Reeves drew a profound breath, the air hissing through his teeth to form a razor-thin whisper. He marched grimly forward. The boots of the 68-year-old patriarch snapped deeply into the snowpack, leaving behind dark, sunken craters. The remaining 3 men shadowed him closely, their herd instinct compelling them to cluster together in defense against an unnameable menace. Talcott mounted the porch steps constructed of rotting pine. Every footfall birthed a groaning creak from the floorboards, a sound of splintering ruin amidst the deafening void. The old man swung the heel of his boot, kicking away the snowpack barricading the door. The blow kicked up a cloud of crystalline dust that hovered suspended in the freezing ether. Talcott raised a hand clad in coarse leather and rapped 3 heavy knocks against the thick wooden door. The sound ricocheted, echoing hollow and dry. Inside, it remained as deathly still as a tomb sealed centuries past. The old man snapped his head back, casting his 3 companions a lightless pitch-black stare, then slowly reached out to grasp the rusted metal latch. His fingers tightened. The latch lifted with a minuscule, razor-sharp clack that tore through their eardrums. Stripped of its anchoring weight, the door slowly, agonizingly swung inward on its hinges, opening into the murky darkness, unleashing something that had been suppressed for far too long. The expedition into the physical realm had concluded, yielding to the precipice where the boundary of true madness shattered. The wooden door slowly swayed, creaking as it gave way to the pitch-black maw within, and what surged out to greet them through that narrow gap was not the brain-numbing chill of an icy sepulchre, but rather a nauseating suffocation. Talcott froze dead upon the threshold. The 68-year-old man, who had once brazenly shouldered a rifle to hunt bear in the most blinding of blizzards, suddenly violently shuddered and recoiled a half-step, the muscle fibers in his neck twitching wildly. The air hemorrhaging from that darkness bore an entirely perverse temperature. By all rights, an abandoned cabin, devoid of a cooking fire at the zenith of February in the Appalachians, should have mutated into a colossal icebox where every water molecule precipitated into frost. Yet, the current washing over the faces of the 4 men was tepid, possessing a feverish heat. It was absolutely not the comforting, arid warmth of a roaring hearth. It was the clammy, viscous heat of an airtight, sealed chamber, where an unknown quota of living entities had sat panting incessantly, exhaling thick plumes of carbon dioxide that had circulated back and forth through their lungs for a grotesquely prolonged period. Accompanying that pathological temperature was an odor that instantly sent the young Deputy Wilm Rye's stomach violently churning, forcing him to clamp a hand over his mouth to suppress a bout of emesis. Burl Hatcher, sitting trembling before his own fireplace many years later, would rack his brain to articulate that smell to his wife. He claimed it mirrored the exact stench of his grandmother's turnip cellar during the sweltering afternoons of July, a loamy, earthy reek of humus, of roots silently rotting beneath the soil. But far worse than that organic decomposition, lurking just beneath the layer of mulch, was another razor-thin fragrance, a cloying, syrupy sweetness, an odor steeped in patience. It was as still and deliberate as the scent of a pitcher plant gaping its maw in anticipation. It besieged their olfactory senses, so dense that their tongues could taste its astringent bitterness in the back of their throats. They stepped haltingly over the threshold, their boot soles grinding harshly against the tarnished floorboards. The ashen light bleeding in from the outdoors provided only enough illumination to dimly sketch the front half of the parlor. This was the precise locus where all conventional logic regarding tragedy began to fracture. There were no blood spatters decorating the walls. There was no shattered furniture, no overturned chairs, not a solitary trace of a desperate physical struggle against a wild beast or a marauder. The absence of violence, ironically, proved 1,000 times more horrifying than violence itself. The parlor manifested with the stillness of a still-life painting, spellbound and frozen by time. Upon the scuffed oak table, Octavius's pipe remained in place. A pinch of dark golden tobacco threads had been freshly tamped halfway up the bowl, a few dry strands spilling carelessly beside it. Lying parallel, flush against the pipe, was an unlit matchstick. The storm lantern, resting on the shelf, bore a bone-dry wick, yet the reservoir of kerosene within the glass bulb remained brimming to the cap's line. The blackened iron kettle sat dormant upon the deaf-mute stove, The ashes within the grate had compacted into a dense gray slab, testifying that the fire had perished a very, very long time ago. Through the narrow adjacent doorway, they could observe the twin single beds in the sleeping quarters, still perfectly made, the blankets squared away without a single skewed crease. Everything this parlor refused to scream of an untimely, catastrophic demise. Instead, it whispered an insane truth. No sudden calamity had descended to strike them down. The Purnell brothers were simply engaged in their mundane, tedious chores, preparing to ignite a late pipe, when abruptly, something had demanded their attention. Something in the back room had called out to them. They serenely abandoned their earthly anchors, calmly rose to their feet, stepped into that space, and made the unilateral decision to never step back out. Talcott swallowed dryly, marching grimly toward the closed door of the back chamber. That space was fundamentally a storage, a cramped, low-ceilinged confinement where the brothers hoarded animal pelts, labor tools, and the wooden crates of canned goods Octavius faithfully procured from town. The old man inhaled a profound breath, allowing the nauseating air to inflate his chest, then slowly pushed the door wide. The hinges shrieked with an arid, bone-dry wail. The rear chamber was entirely submerged in darkness, save for the feeble light spilling from the parlor over the shoulders of the four men. The singular window of the room, no larger than two outstretched hands, had been utterly sealed off. A swath of dark, abrasive fabric had been stretched taut and meticulously nailed shut, bristling with tacks along the wooden frame. The rusted nails pinned the cloth's edges mercilessly, denying even the most microscopic, hair-thin ray of light entry from the outside world. It was a rejection of reality executed with a hair-raising meticulousness. As their pupils began to dilate, adjusting to accommodate the coagulated dark, the tableau within slowly materialized like phantoms rising from a black lake. The storage room was no longer a storage room. Everything, the rolled pelts, the pickaxes, the shovels, the wooden crates of beans, the sacks of salt, had all been hauled, cleared, and stacked into rigid, geometric blocks pressed flush into the four corners of the walls. The arrangement was terrifyingly immaculate, as though they had purged the epa of the room, transforming the bare floorboards into a closed theater for a silent ritual. And right in the dead center of that polished expanse of wood, Octavius and Lucius were sitting. They sat cross-legged, folded into perfect symmetry. The two brothers faced one another, separated by an invisible void measuring precisely 3 feet across, no more, no less. That distance was as flawless and exact as two grand masters sitting opposed across a chessboard. Their spines were held rigidly vertical, their palms were turned upward, resting with a terrifying languor upon their knees. Wilm Rye stumbled a half-step backward, a choked sob tearing from his throat as the beam of the flashlight swept across them. The Purnell brothers were not dead. The rib cages beneath their grimy woolen sweaters were still slowly inflating, then deflating, a sluggish rhythmic cadence, the senseless respiration of entities submerged in a flawless catatonic state. No blood had been spilled. There were no marks of bindings, nor any physical trauma that could rationalize why two burly men would voluntarily incarcerate themselves in a pitch-black, freezing room, sitting immobilized face to face through the endless, agonizing months of winter. But when Talcott aimed the flickering, pallid beam directly into their faces, all four of the rescuers felt a block of glacial lead plummet straight into their bowels. The eyes of the two brothers were wide and bulging, the pale, colorless irises of Octavius and the bloodshot, crimson-veined sclera of Lucius did not blink. Their pupils were glassy, parched, coated in a hazy film resembling the scales of a drowned fish. Their bodies lived in the manner that a tree lives, but the human element, the soul, the consciousness, or whatever fabric forged their identity within those shells, had departed long ago. The deputy, Wilm, would later shakily document in a drafted report, one that was subsequently censored and discarded prior to archiving, that the moment he locked eyes with them, the sensation strangling his mind was not pity, nor was it the panic of witnessing a massacre. He possessed an absolute, unshakable premonition that he had just accidentally driven his boot into a realm of space unfit for mankind. He felt like an intrusive, vulgar third party trespassing upon a secret that the human brain was never permitted to process. The most feral craving clawing at Wilm's skull in that moment was to stumble backward, slam the door shut, run for his life down the valley and permanently seal this memory away. Talcott Reeves, armed with the stubborn obstinacy of old age, was the first to rip through the silence. He spoke, his voice hoarse and dry, rebounding against the narrow wooden walls. "Octavius." There was no reaction, not a flutter of an eyelash, not a muted groan. "Octavius, can you hear me?" The old man hollered louder, taking a step forward, his boot planting upon the slick floor. Still, absolute deafness. Talcott bridged the gap, dropping to one knee beside the flank of the elder brother. He reached out. The stiffened cowhide glove made contact with Octavius's sloping shoulder. Through the layers of wool, the old man could feel the feverish body heat, the rhythmic contraction of muscle as the lungs expanded. He gently gripped Octavius's shoulder and shook him. The shaking intensified, mirroring how one might violently jostle a drunkard to drag him from a stupor. Under that crude physical manipulation, Octavius's pupils finally registered a shift, but he did not blink. He absolutely did not turn his face to look at Talcott, the man who was vigorously kneading his shoulder. His pupils drifted with an excruciating slowness, grinding laboriously like glass marbles rolling across a dust-caked mirror, and then they locked dead onto a coordinate hovering just over Talcott's left shoulder. His gaze pinned itself to that dead space, converging with a hyperfixated, intoxicating madness. It was as if, right behind Talcott's back, there existed an entity infinitely more radiant, 10,000 times more mesmerizing than the presence of these flesh-and-blood men. Talcott immediately whipped his head around to look behind him. His survival instinct caused the hairs on his nape to bristle, his hand poised to draw the hunting knife resting on his hip. But the space behind him was utterly vacant. There was only the gaping doorway, his three companions standing paralyzed with bloodless faces, and the mute parlor drowning in gray shadows. There was absolutely nothing there to warrant Octavius staring with such a morbid, spellbound infatuation. Simultaneously, on the opposing side of the chessboard, Burl Hatcher mustered the courage to shuffle over to Lucius. The corpulent grocer reached out a trembling hand to rest upon the younger brother's shoulder, and identical to what was unfolding across the room, Lucius offered zero reaction to Hatcher. His eyes languidly drifted, sliding past the sweat-drenched, panting face of Burl, and anchored themselves to an invisible coordinate in the ether, suspended directly behind the grocer's skull. It took many weeks before the men, hauling that colossal boulder of silence back down from the mountain, mustered the courage to sit down and splice those geometric fragments together, and, when the truth finally dawned on them, they vomited in sheer revulsion. In that pitch-black room, Talcott knelt on the left beside Octavius. Burl knelt on the right beside Lucius. The Purnell brothers sat face to face, nearly a meter apart. Yet their gazes slid past their rescuers, transcended the physical confines of the body, and they intersected. They were not staring blankly at the two opposing walls. The trajectory of Octavius's and Lucius's sight lines were simultaneously converging upon a singular point suspended dead in the center of the chamber, elevated at a slight angle in the empty void between them. A third coordinate, no optical law or random chance, could dictate that two diametrically opposed stairs would conjoin at such a flawless angle, unless, right at that invisible nexus, there truly existed something possessing a physical form. An entity unbridled by the material world, emitting no heat, reflecting no light, but acting as a shared occupant that the two brothers had feverishly sat observing, communing with for so long that their retinas had known how to process mundane objects. The atmosphere was pulled taut as a violin string, on the verge of violently snapping. Talcott Reeves, consumed by the desperate stubbornness of him wishing to shatter a nightmare, resorted to brute force. The old man threaded his bony, sinewy arms beneath Octavius's armpits, grunting as he strained to hoist that emaciated frame up from the floorboards. Octavius offered no resistance, nor did he flex a single muscle to assist. His body turned to mush, harboring the lethal, dragging dead weight of a waterlogged log. He let his limbs dangle freely, his torso slumping in subservience to Talcott's arduous pulling. The old man struggled, managing to drag him halfway to a standing position, forcing that slumped figure to lean heavily against his hip. And in that devastating fraction of a second, when the perfect 3-foot chasm was breached, when the geometry of the silent ritual was warped, Octavius slowly parted his lips. His diluted eyes never once severed their connection from that invisible intersection, but the larynx beneath his wrinkled throat began to vibrate. The abrasive friction of a parched throat, unused for vocalization for months on end, sounded as horrifying as fingernails clawing at rotted wood. In a slow, pealing cadence, utterly devoid of every nuance of human emotion, Octavius uttered a single sentence. Talcott heard it. Burl Hatcher heard it. No soul on this earth knows what that sentence was. Talcott Reeves padlocked that sequence of sounds within his ribcage like a malignant tumor, carrying it down to the very bottom of his grave, only wheezing it out to his wife on a winter's night decades later, moments before his heart ceased to beat. But every man present in that suffocating room agreed upon what occurred the very instant after that grotesque phrase slithered from Octavius's lips. On the opposite side of the barren floor, Lucius, the mute, the brute, the man who forever bore a hostile stance, primed to tear the world asunder, slowly blossomed into a smile. His body remained paralyzed, his eyes still glued to the suspended void in the room, but the cracked, ulcerated corners of his mouth beneath that pitch-black beard began to curl upward. It stretched toward his ears with a sluggish, contorted, and rigid tension. This was unequivocally not the senseless grin of a raving lunatic screaming within an asylum. It harbored a lucidity and a comprehension that was absolutely nauseating. It mirrored the exact reaction of a man who had just heard his brother whisper an invaluable secret, a morbid, sadistic jest that only the two of them, and that invisible entity, were capable of savoring, a consensus that transcended the boundaries of humanity. Standing from the threshold of the parlor, the lumberjack Audric witnessed that smile, and he felt his kneecaps melt like hot wax. From within the shadows of the chamber before him, he heard Burl Hatcher involuntarily expel a trembling breath, fracturing into shattered fragments. "Oh, it's that thing!" That was not a blood-curdling scream of terror. Conversely, it was the way a man mutters in a fugue state when he abruptly comprehends a truth of apocalyptic proportions. A truth so vile that he wished he could gouge out his own eyes and puncture his own eardrums in that very moment, just to ensure he would never have to shoulder the burden of that understanding again. The load-bearing wall of reality had suffered a total collapse. They knew with absolute certainty that if they lingered in this room for even a fraction of a second longer, their own eyes would begin to instinctively hunt for that nexus point, and they would never be able to turn their heads to look upon the normal world again. They dragged the Purnell brothers out of the darkened chamber. Contrary to every anticipation of a violent struggle, the evacuation proceeded with a smoothness that was profoundly chilling. Octavius and Lucius did not thrash about. They marched when they were hauled. They obediently buckled their knees and sat when they were shoved into the belly of the sled, acting as severed marionettes discarded in the refuse. Their bodies were entirely slack, surrendering to the crude physical forces acting upon them. Yet, their resistance lay anchored in an entirely different dimension: their eyes. As the sled began to careen and jolt down the inclines of Strangler Ridge, plowing through the ashen drifts, the topographical angle of the earth constantly violently shifted. But the heads of the two brothers operated like a gyroscopic stabilizer on the most complex of machineries. If the sled tilted left, their necks cranked to the right. If the sled plunged nose first down a precipitous slope, their chins tilted sharply upward toward the heavens. Despite their bodies being battered and jostled, the irises of Octavius and Lucius remained permanently locked onto the exact same singular coordinate in the sky, hovering just above the barren canopy. It was as though the invisible entity from that wooden room had not remained upon the peak. It was floating, pursuing them on their descent into the valley. The young deputy Wilm Rye brought up the rear of the convoy. He trudged sullenly, his neck buried deep into his collar, cementing his panicked eyes to the toes of his slush-soaked boots for 4 agonizing hours. Wilm did not dare to raise his head to look at the napes of the Purnell brothers even once. He was terrified that, should he accidentally follow the trajectory of those clouded eyes, he would genuinely bear witness to the thing that was drifting overhead. The procession arrived in the town of Marlington just as the sky began to bleed light, dragging with them the stench of frost and the miasma of an unseen plague. The brothers were stretchered directly into the cramped back room of Dr. Marius Pelliter. the sole practitioner who had served this god-forsaken territory for 31 years, a space reeking of iodine and ether. Pellider instantly rolled up his sleeves to conduct an examination. He peeled back their eyelids, shined a penlight into their pupils, and pressed his freezing stethoscope to Lucius's brawny chest. The resulting diagnostics were a slap in the face to all medical logic. There were no signs of malnutrition, not a single blister of frostbite. The heartbeats of both men were sluggish and lethargic, yet as metronomically steady as the strike of a felt-wrapped mallet. When Pellider pinched their noses to force their jaws open and poured water down their throats, their Adam's apples instinctively bobbed up and down, swallowing loudly without so much as a gag or a cough. Biologically speaking, Octavius and Lucius were two middle-aged men in far superior health to the vast majority of coal miners down in the valley. Their bodies were dual machineries operating flawlessly. The only caveat was that the pilots of those machines had discarded the steering wheels and evacuated the cockpits long ago. Pellider resolved to stay awake for 2 consecutive nights to monitor them in the annex, and on the second night, at precisely 3 in the morning, as the atmosphere of Marlington coagulated into absolute stillness, he witnessed an event that caused a veteran physician to tremblingly scrawl an entry into his ledger. The final jagged words he would ever write concerning the Purnells. Pellider was nursing a sip of stone-cold coffee, his eyelids heavy. Without warning, upon the twin cots both Octavius and Lucius stirred simultaneously. There was no auditory cue to herald it. They moved in the exact same microsecond, with the flawless synchronization of 2 gears interlocking within the same apparatus. Both slowly rotated their heads to the right, angling their faces toward the exposed brick wall on the eastern side of the room. They did not wake. Their eyes remained stretched wide, vacuous and dead. They held that rigid torsion of the neck with absolute conviction, listening to an invisible acoustic frequency penetrating through the mortar and stone. Exactly 41 minutes later, without a second's deviation, both simultaneously swiveled their heads back to their original supine positions, resuming the rhythmic heaving respiration of driftwood bobbing on a river. Dr. Pellider dropped his coffee mug, letting it shatter into porcelain shrapnel upon the floor. Within his fraying notebook, he documented but a single, profoundly impotent sentence. "I do not know what they are listening to." By the second week of February, state authorities dispatched personnel down from the capital. The Purnell brothers were stuffed into an ambulance and transferred directly to the State Psychiatric Hospital in Charleston. There, arrogant physicians clad in pristine white coats swiftly deduced a grotesque paradigm. If they aligned the brothers parallel or head-to-head, within the span of a single night, the bodies of these 2 men would autonomously slide and contort upon the coil mattresses, relentlessly adjusting themselves until their faces were once again opposed to one another. Ultimately, to prevent them from fracturing their own bones, in the effort, the hospital was compelled to arrange the 2 beds facing one another symmetrically in opposite corners of the ward. They lived out the remainder of their vegetative existence in that room reeking of antiseptic. Octavius expelled his final breath in 1963. Lucius, much like a shadow deprived of its casting object, silently expired exactly 11 days later. In the medical dossiers, the chief of psychiatry scrawled a term rarely utilized in psychoanalysis. He dictated that the brothers' condition was not a state of being absent, but rather occupied. Their minds were not an abandoned house. It was a property that had been sublet, and the current tenant possessed no desire to vacate the premises. But the deaths of the Purnell brothers did not serve as a definitive period. The monstrosity birthed from the isolation atop Strangler Ridge did not rend human flesh. It infected perception. It latched on to the voyeurs who accidentally glimpsed it and slowly corroded them from the inside out. The 4 men of the rescue party carried that pathogen back to their hearths, and each decomposed in his own unique fashion. Wilm Rye, the young deputy with an expansive future, abruptly tendered his resignation that very summer. He packed his belongings, dragged his wife and children into exile in Ohio, and buried his life within a livestock feed store suffocating under the stench of corn mash. Wilm lived a mute, invisible life, never returning to Pocahontas County, not even to attend his own blood brother's funeral. In the last will and testament drafted before his death, he strictly forbade any mention of his tenure as a lawman in West Virginia within his obituary. He desired to violently scrub his existence from the gaze of that past. Audric Sewell, the obstinate lumberjack, continued to reside in Marlington until 1982. But he remained perpetually mute regarding the events on the mountain. Should a drunken fool accidentally broach the subject, Audric would avert his face, his eyes darkening to a pitch-black storm. The sole clue he allowed to leak out over the duration of his remaining years was a hushed whisper to his biological daughter. Sometimes a man's eyes get pulled away by something, and they never quite manage to fit all the way back into the sockets. As for Burl Hatcher, the portly grocer, the infection bloomed into a macabre strain of paranoia. From that February of 1956 onward, Hatcher flinched violently at the most minuscule rustle. He developed a pathological phobia of the dark. Hatcher burned storm lanterns in his bedchamber every night, illuminating every single corner of his house with a blinding glare until the day he succumbed to heart failure in 1971. When his wife complained of the exorbitant cost of kerosene, Hatcher cast a furtive, terrified glance into a shadowed nook beneath the bed and hissed, "I don't want anyone, or anything. Thinking I'm not here, I have to show it that I still exist." Hatcher was terrified of the silence. He feared that if he remained quiet and surrendered to the dark, the very thing that had swallowed the Purnells would view him as the next vacancy to be occupied. The most devastating, the most tragic of all, was Talcott Reeves. The old man bore that solitary sentence of Octavius inside his ribcage for 22 agonizing years. It eroded his vitality, transfiguring him into a withered, desiccated husk. On the night of his deathbed in 1978, he wheezed that phrase out to his wife. She hastily transcribed it onto the back cover of a Bible. Yet she recognized that, as Talcott recited it, the cadence of his voice bore no nostalgic remembrance. He spewed out that sequence of words with the horrifying fluency of a man who had silently chanted it tens of thousands of times within his own skull every time he shut his eyes. A few years following her own passing, their niece unearthed the paper. She testified that the very instant her fingers grazed the edge of the parchment, the temperature in the room plummeted drastically, and a clammy, profoundly wrong sensation washed over her, making her violently shudder. She tossed the paper straight into the roaring hearth, without daring to read a single letter. The secret of Octavius was eternally reduced to ash. The cabin atop Strangler Ridge, according to local lore, still stands today. The porch roof has caved in, the hog pen has rotted into sawdust, and nature has reclaimed the barren clearing. Yet the diminutive backroom, the epicenter of the silent ritual, remains impossibly intact against the ravages of time, despite enduring over 70 years without maintenance. The dark fabric remains securely tacked over the window frame. In 2012, a lost hunter from Virginia wandered up to the site, snapped a few photographs with a digital camera, and fled in a blind panic, delivering them to a folklorist in Charleston. In those blurry, heavily grained images, one can clearly perceive a patch of floorboards dead center in the room, worn down to a polished, varnished sheen. That is the byproduct of two burly men sitting cross-legged, immobile for months on end, their flesh and fabric grinding against the grain to etch an eternal scar of despair. But the most horrifying element resides in the second photograph. Hovering directly above that polished wood, branded against the rear wall, is a long, elongated dark shadow. It might merely be a stain of weeping tree sap. It might be an optical anomaly of the camera's flash. It possesses the silhouette of a towering, emaciated entity, leaning forward, attentively observing the empty void below. The folklorist scrawled across the exterior of the file folder in glaring red ink, "Possible photographic artifact. Do not enlarge under any circumstances." When asked why he did not step fully into the room to capture a clearer shot rather than cowering upon the threshold, the hunter remained silent for a long while. He lit a cigarette, took a drag so deep his cheekbones hollowed, and replied, "Because there was an empty space right in the middle of those polished floorboards. I had an overwhelming premonition that if I stepped forward and sat down in that spot, I would instantly understand exactly what those two men were looking at. And you know what? I absolutely do not want to know. I have spent countless sleepless nights doing nothing but ruminating upon that polished scar of wood, pondering what Octavius and Lucius Purnell were truly doing throughout the blinding blizzards of November, December, and January. Pondering the immaculate woodpile stacked on the porch that was destined to never be set ablaze. People often tell one another that solitude and the cold can drive a man insane, that they hallucinate, lose their minds, and imprison themselves until death takes them. But the truth is infinitely more terrifying. Total isolation does not operate like a vacuum cleaner, sucking the minds of the Purnell brothers completely dry to leave behind an empty skull. No, isolation is akin to throwing open the front door of your house in the dead of night, extinguishing every light, and sitting silently in an armchair. The genesis is always emptiness, but eventually, at some point, something from the exterior darkness will step through the doorway to fill the void you have just invited in. The Purnell brothers did not lose their sanity. They did not go mad, they simply found something else, something worth paying attention to. Something far more intoxicating than staying warm, more vital than eating, more imperative than being human. That thing manifested in the darkened chamber. It commanded them to look at it, to listen to it, and they obliged, until their eyes forgot how to perceive the trivialities of the mortal realm. Tonight, before we conclude, I want you to perform a task. Cast your eyes around the room in which you currently sit. Is there a hidden corner, a shadowed patch beneath the desk, a narrow fissure between the wardrobe and the wall, a place where you subconsciously avert your gaze every time you walk past? Do you ignore it because you genuinely do not care? Or is it because some profound, ancient fragment of your primal instinct is screaming at you, warning you that, if you stare long enough into that patch of darkness, the thing coiled inside will take notice and begin to stare back at you? Tell me in the comments. Tell me about the dark corner you never dare to shine a flashlight into. Tell me about the scuffling noises you continually deceive yourself into believing are just the scampering of mice. I will read them all, as is customary, while leaving my desk lamp burning bright until the morning sun, exactly the way Burl Hatcher did. Thank you for listening to Hope Tales tonight. If you appreciate narratives that walk counter to the light, stories that dissect the naked truth of the human mind, leave a like and subscribe. Remember to double-check your locks, and please, do not stare too long into an empty corner of the wall. I will see you all at the bottom of the next mountain. Goodbye.